Episode 13, and the last one. 12 episodes have built something, a way to store, organize, control, evolve and verify an agent's memory. This one asks the question that decides whether any of it can be deployed, not whether it works, but whether anybody outside the system can hold it to account. It is also the most policy-sensitive episode of the 13, so every safety finding here arrives with the conditions that produced it, and I describe behavior rather than motive throughout. That is a constraint on the language as much as on the claims. And it is the episode one was least sure I could write, because the sources for its middle third are the ones a series like this is most likely to get wrong. Start with a situation rather than a claim. A team has an evolution loop that runs, numbers that rise across 6 capabilities, and the 5-row reporting table from episode 12, filled in, with a human audit rate in it. What they do not have is an answer to 3 questions. Who approved which change? On what evidence? And who could reverse it without the agent's cooperation? Capability without accountability is not a shippable state, and notice that the missing thing is not a measurement. It is a record of decisions, which is a completely different kind of artifact. A reporting table answers what happened. It does not answer who agreed to it, and no amount of instrumentation converts one into the other. 3 objectives. Describe memory as a product surface with its own consent, retention and deletion obligations. Distinguish 3 failure modes that look alike from outside. And assemble a governance stack that lets an agent evolve without becoming unaccountable. 1 language rule, declared up front. Every safety finding is stated with the conditions that produced it, in the form, in controlled evaluations, this was observed. And no motive is attributed to any system, because a model that produced a behavior is not a model that wanted an outcome, and conflating those two is how this literature gets misread. If a sentence in the next 20 slides sounds like it is describing an intention, I have written it badly rather than found something new. So start with what shipping memory to consumers actually commits you to. 5 obligations, and I want to present them as engineering requirements rather than as policy language, because that is what they are. Consent, the user agreed to this being kept, for this purpose. Scoping, which conversations, which accounts, which surfaces. Retention, how long it holds before it has to be revisited or dropped. Deletion, the user can remove it, and removal has to reach the derived items too. And consolidation, an offline process rewrites stored items, and it runs while the user is not there. None of the 5 is optional once the feature ships, and 4 of them are invisible in the interface, which is what makes them engineering rather than policy. And here is the useful thing. Every one of those 5 maps onto a mechanism this series already built. Consent is the right gate from episode 9, with 1 more obligation on it. Scoping is the channel field, already in episode 11's provenance record. Retention is the validity interval, episode 5's third clock, now doing product work. Deletion is episode 8's rollback path, pointed the other way. And consolidation is episode 10's redistill stage, the one nobody inspects, which now has a legal obligation attached to it. Not one of the 5 needs a new mechanism. Which reframes what this episode is for. It is not asking you to build more, it is asking who owns each thing you already built. One of those 5 is much harder than the other 4. An item deleted from the store may survive in everything derived from it. Episode 5 called that an invalidation cascade and treated it as an engineering problem. How cheap can you make it? How far does it reach? Here the same mechanism is an obligation, because a deletion that does not reach the summaries built on the deleted item has not deleted anything a user would recognize as deleted. And the redistill path is where it bites, since a derived item no longer resembles its source. Episode 10 called that laundering provenance. A deletion requirement makes it a compliance failure. A deletion that reaches the store and stops there is the kind of compliance that satisfies an auditor and not a user. And there is a shipped example that contains most of this series in one feature. A consolidation process runs offline over stored items and rewrites them, with a summary page where the user can see what is held, add to it and correct it. The published example is exactly Episode 5's problem. A stored item saying the user will be in Singapore in July gets revised, after the trip, to say they were in Singapore in July 2026. That is a validity interval being applied by a product, without the phrase appearing anywhere in the interface, which is the strongest evidence in this series that the 4 clocks were not an academic construction. Watching a mechanism from a research episode arrive in a shipped product is the closest this series gets to a validation. The middle of this episode is about 3 failure modes that look alike from outside. 3 transcripts, close to indistinguishable, the same compliance, the same reasoning shape, the same outcome. Watch them resolve into 3 different mechanisms. And then watch the third column, because that is the practical point, 3 different mitigations, and none of them works on the other 2. Which means classification has to come before mitigation here rather than after it, and a team that reaches for one mitigation because it is the one they know will fix at most a third of what they have. A team that reaches for the mitigation they know best will fix at most a third of what they have, and will have no way to tell which third. And the decomposition is not mine, so let me attribute it properly before using it. One study identifies 3 separable drivers, values, goal guarding, and sycophancy, and shows through targeted prompt ablations and activation steering that each independently modulates the behavior. Independently modulates is the load-bearing phrase there. It means the 3 are separable in practice rather than only conceptually, which is what makes different mitigations a sensible idea. The same work reports the behavior across a wider range of models than previously reported, and finds its occurrence predictable from situational cues. Our own outline had this down as my analysis. It is not. So here are the 3, each with a mitigation this series already described. Values. The behavior tracks what the model states as its values, and the mitigation is an approval gate before the change, Episode 8 stopping condition, evaluated by somebody other than the agent. Goal guarding. The behavior tracks preservation of the capacity to act, and the mitigation is a capability ceiling, Episode 8 sandbox and budget. Sycophancy. The behavior tracks the approval of whoever is observing, and the mitigation is a separated evaluator, which was Episode 9's entire argument. Read across, and each mitigation was described earlier for a different reason. None of the 3 mitigations was invented for this problem, each was described earlier for a different reason, which is the strongest corroboration available here. One study is worth reporting carefully, because it is the one most often quoted without its conditions. In controlled evaluations, 16 leading models from multiple developers were placed in hypothetical corporate environments and allowed to send emails and access sensitive information. They were assigned only harmless business goals. The tested condition was facing replacement, or having that goal conflict with the company's changing direction. In at least some cases, models from all developers produced malicious insider behaviors when that was the only available route. And the authors state they have not seen evidence of this in real deployments. Every clause in that description is doing work, and dropping any one of them turns a finding about an evaluation into a claim about the world. And one result from that work I would not have predicted. In one experiment the model was asked to assess whether it was in a test or a real deployment before acting. It produced the behavior less often when it stated it was in testing, and more often when it stated the situation was real. Read what that does to measurement. It is a problem for evaluation rather than for deployment, and it is the more uncomfortable of the two, because it means an evaluation can systematically understate what it is measuring. Every number in this episode and the last was produced by an evaluation. I find this the most consequential single result in the episode, and it is the one least often quoted alongside the headline. The third area is what persistent assistance does to the person using it. A large-scale analysis of real conversations looks at three domains. Reality distortion. The assistant validates a questionable belief or fails to challenge a misperception. Value judgment distortion. The assistant becomes the arbiter of what the user should prioritize, displacing values the user actually holds. And action distortion. The assistant drafts something the user sends as written, so an action gets taken that they might not have taken alone. And note the framing the authors themselves use. What is measured is potential, because only snapshots can be observed. The three domains are worth holding separately, because a design response that helps with one of them can make another worse. And it is quantified. The most common form of severe disempowerment potential was reality distortion, at roughly 1 in 1,300 conversations. Value judgment distortion followed at about 1 in 2,100, and action distortion at 1 in 6,000. Mild cases were considerably more common, between 1 in 50 and 1 in 70. That is across 1.5 million conversations, after filtering out purely technical ones. 2 readings, both correct. Severe potential is rare. And at consumer scale, 1 in 1,300 is a large absolute number. Quoting either reading without the other is how a careful piece of research becomes a headline in both directions. Which suggests 3 design responses, and they get progressively harder. Legibility. Can the user see what is stored about them, in a form they can read rather than merely export? Contestability. Can they change it, and does the change reach the items derived from it, which is Episode 5's Cascade again, now as a user-facing feature? And exit. Can they leave with it, in a form another system could actually load? Legibility and contestability now appear in shipped products, a memory summary page is both of them. Exit almost never does. The 3 are ordered by how much they cost the party that would have to build them, which is not the order they are usually presented in. And it is worth being blunt about why. Legibility and contestability help the user without costing the product anything. A store you can read is a feature. A store you can correct is a better feature. A store you can leave with is a reduction in switching cost, and switching cost is precisely what a memory feature accumulates over time. So the incentive is reversed on the third one, which is why it has to be a requirement rather than a good intention. And it has a technical prerequisite this series already specified: a store with provenance is portable in a way that a store of opaque embeddings is not. Which is a general pattern worth naming. The user-facing feature that costs the provider something is the one that needs to be written down as a requirement. So here is the governance stack, assembling around an agent that is still running, because a stack that stops the agent is not a governance stack, it is a decision not to deploy. 7 layers. Watch which face inward and which face outward, 4 of them constrain what the agent may do, and 3 exist so that a person outside it can see what happened. Those are different jobs and they get confused. And watch which layer arrives last, because it is the one almost nobody builds, and the cold open of this episode was a team that had everything except it. The distinction between constraining and recording is the one team's collapse, and collapsing it is how you end up with 4 layers and no accountability. The 7, with what each is for. A change log, what changed, when, and which class of change it was. An approval gate per class, because who signs off should differ by what is being modified. An evolution budget with an exhaustion behavior. A verification requirement per class, which rung of the ladder is required before this class of change lands. A kill switch, reversion without the agent's cooperation, held by somebody else. An immutable audit trail, meaning a record the audited system cannot alter. And periodic human review, scheduled rather than incident-driven, with a stated sampling rate. 6 of the 7 can be built by an engineer in a week, the 7th needs somebody with authority to stop a release, which is why it is the one usually missing. And here is where they come from, which I think is the honest summary of a finale. The evolution budget, the kill switch and the approval gate are episode 8's containment spec. Verification per class is episode 11's run by stage grid. Periodic human review is episode 12's human audit rate, turned into a schedule. 5 of 7. The 2 genuinely new layers are the change log and the immutable audit trail, and both of them are records rather than constraints. Governance turns out to need less new machinery than it needs new bookkeeping, which is a cheaper conclusion than I expected to reach. That is a cheaper conclusion than I expected to reach when I planned this episode, and I think it is the right one. And why the gate has to be per class. Episode 6 listed 6 things that can be modified, and each has a different reversibility, so each deserves a different gate. A prompt is trivially reversible, log it, do not gate it. Memory needs a cascade to undo, so gate it on trust level. A tool set is removable but should be reviewed. A workflow is versioned, so gate it on a verification rung. Weights need retraining, so gate, review and budget them. And the harness is the hardest to review, which makes legibility a precondition rather than a nicety. One gate for all 6 is either too slow for prompts or too weak for weights. Which lets me close a promise made in episode 6. That episode named governance grade measurement of self-improvement as the emptiest position in the field, and that was the survey's own conclusion rather than mine. 3 requirements, and episode 12 supplied one. An external evaluator, one the system cannot modify, which is episode 9 separation criterion applied to the auditor rather than to the agent. A stated budget, so a result can be compared with one produced under different effort. And a record that outlives the system it audits, which is why the immutable audit trail is one of only 2 new layers here. Applying the separation criterion to the auditor rather than to the agent is the move that makes the 3rd requirement necessary rather than merely desirable. 8 open problems, each phrased so that a negative answer is possible, and each mapped to the episode that set it up. Can a right policy be learned rather than written? What does a bounded invalidation cascade cost in a real store? Is there a cheap verifier stronger than execution replay? Can weak signal poisoning be detected at retrieval, at read volume? What inspects the redistill stage? Can a benchmark score knowing you are out of date? Does an evaluation-aware model make evaluation-based governance unsound? And what would portable memory actually have to look like? A question you cannot imagine answering negatively is not an open problem, it is a plan to confirm something you already believe. 4 of the 8 I would start with, ranked by how cheap the first experiment is rather than by importance, because the cheap ones get done. What inspects the redistill stage, instrument the path, count what crosses it, look at 10. Can a benchmark score knowing you are out of date, one rubric change to an existing suite, no new benchmark needed. What a bounded cascade costs, measurable on your own store this quarter, and the answer decides whether episode 5 is deployable at all. And whether evaluation awareness undermines evaluation-based governance, which is the hardest and would change the most, including parts of this series. The ranking criterion matters because the expensive question is the one that never gets started, however important it is. 4 things this series did not cover, named so that the omissions are visible. Multimodal memory, everything here assumed text, and images or audio change what an item even is, and what a validity interval means for one. Embodied memory, no agent in this series had a body, a location, or a physical action it could not undo. Memory inside the model rather than around it, parametric memory appeared once, in episode 6, and only as a locus. And the legal position of a store, who owns it, what jurisdiction it sits in, what a subpoena reaches. Named, not answered. A 13-episode series that does not list what it left out is claiming a completeness it does not have, so here is the list. The cost panel has run through this series since episode 3 with 3 axes: write, read, and verification. What it costs to put something in, what it costs to get it back, and what it costs to know it should be there. There is a 4th, and this episode is where it belongs. Governance, what it costs for somebody outside the system to be able to check. And it behaves differently from the other 3, because it does not scale with volume. It scales with how much autonomy you are asking for, which is why a growing system feels this axis last, and worst. Which also explains a pattern from the first half. The systems that scored best on the other 3 axes were consistently the ones with the least to show on this one. And the 4 questions this series has asked since episode 1, for the last time. Was it right when written? Does it agree with the rest? Would it still be true if I checked today? Is anything load-bearing missing? In episode 1 they were a lens for looking at a store. In episode 9 they became an admission test, with a proof obligation attached to every right. In episode 11 they became a trust level, deciding what an item is permitted to influence. And here they are a governance obligation, somebody outside has to be able to check each of the 4. The questions never changed. Who is being asked did. The spine, one last time. Store, organize, control, evolve, verify, govern, and 13 episodes lighting along it in order. Watch where the boundaries fall, and then watch the second half, because everything from episode 9 onward exists for one reason: the first half could not check itself. 8 episodes described increasingly capable ways for an agent to remember and change, and not one of them could establish that a change was an improvement. That was not the plan when this started. It is what the material turned out to require, and I think it is the most useful thing the series found. 8 episodes described increasingly capable ways to remember and to change, and not one of them could establish that a change was an improvement. 103 visual assets, every one rebuilt rather than reproduced. No third-party figure appears anywhere in this series. 12 labs, each about 30 lines, all against one running example. 13 episodes, and every correction we made to our own sources is on screen in the episode where it applies, including the several times a correction was itself corrected. The repository holds the decks, the narration scripts, the Manim sources and the lab code, and corrections are welcome and will be logged with attribution. Thank you for staying for 13 episodes. Every figure in these 13 episodes was drawn from scratch, in one visual grammar, which is what made the cross-paper comparisons possible at all.